My name's Matt Tracy. We're talking about utility revenue cases. How do utilities ask for money? Going to jump right in where we left off. We were just talking about discovery. And that's there. And negotiation. We finished up negotiation. Now we're going to talk about the hearings. Hearings are very much like a trial. If you spend any time in a courtroom, which I really can't recommend to anybody, but if you're bored sometime and you have some, a few days, go hang out in a couple of different courtrooms and just see what it's like. It's kind of like what they do on TV, but kind of not. Anyway, it's like a trial. The commissioners will act as the judge and the jury. You will typically have an administrative law judge or a regulatory law judge, depending on the jurisdiction. This will be an attorney who has been hired as a judge. They are predominantly there to see that everybody follows the rules. At the end of this process, you can see, I'll show you that you can actually appeal this onto to the courts. The administrative law judge or regulatory law judge is trying to make sure that there's no grounds for an appeal. They're trying to make sure everybody follows the rules and that everybody got the fair shake. All right? And they're also there administratively making sure, everybody, okay, what time are we going to meet next? How are we going to number this next piece of evidence? All the administrative stuff. There are rules of evidence. The rules of evidence are going to be very similar to what you'd see in any trial. Again, you can't just make stuff up. You can't just assert something. If you're going to make an assertion just out of the air like that, you have to have shown yourself to be an expert in that field, and you have to have proven that in your initial introduction to the court, to the commission. There are rules of evidence. There are more parties. A lot of times through the discovery process, some of the parties will just kind of sit back and they'll be lurkers, just kind of watch what's going on, keep track of all the data requests and whatnot. And then when it comes time for the hearings, they'll jump in, and at that point they'll have questions and whatnot. It's time for cross-examination. Cross-examination is in fact where, if you're a utility employee and you've presented evidence through this whole thing, typically you start off, like I said, we will provide written testimony. Later on, the other parties will then provide rebuttal testimony. We're then allowed to rebut their testimony. Sometimes there's a third round, rebuttal. It goes through. It's just that there's so much information to be covered that they don't want to cover it all live by people talking. There's so much technical information. It's just easier to handle most of it through written testimony early on. But at this point, you're finally here. Your attorney will introduce you. They will say, this is the testimony you filed in this case. If I asked you these questions today, would these be your responses be the same as they were here in your written testimony? And you can either say yes or no. If there's typos, you can fix typos. If you've reached a settlement on some item, you can say, this item has been settled, and so this is no longer pertinent, whatever. That gets covered. Once that's all been introduced, then the other attorneys for all the other parties get a chance to cross-examine you. I always enjoyed cross-examination. Some people really hated it, and some people should really hate it. They were really very bad at it. I enjoyed it. Most of my issues were technical, and I was always very prepared for them. And so that made it very easy for me to show up and testify. There were times when you show up and you're so prepared, and all the other attorneys decide, there's nothing good going to happen from me asking this guy questions. And so they'll just say, no questions, no questions, no questions. And you just spent, 2 or 3 days preparing to come testify, and you got to say your name and you got to go sit down because you're done. A lot of times, though, they will have some specific questions, and a lot of times it will expand into that. Their whole specific skill set for giving testimony, live testimony, and that's something you can cover with an attorney sometime if you ever have to do it. But the basic premise is never lie, because that will come back to bite you. And if you get caught in a lie, then it shoots your credibility for everything. So just don't lie. And be comfortable with what you know. And if you don't know something, say, I don't know. The typical event was that you'd keep passing, oh, I don't know, but we can find out, and one of the following witnesses can provide that response. Because typically you're not allowed to come back later and testify again. It's typically a one-shot deal. Which makes it hard on the last person to testify, because they have to keep track of all of these other things that everybody said, well, we'll have somebody else answer. We'll look it up. They'd better have all those answers, because typically the attorneys will keep track of things you promised, and they will expect someone to answer. Like in a courtroom, it will be transcribed. There will be a court recorder there typing away on their little machine. And then it's an adversarial process. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with this. It's one of the things that honestly almost everybody kind of dislikes about whether it's courtrooms or commission hearings, that sort of thing. An adversarial process basically means it's each party's job to present their own case and to prove their own case. It's not the staff's job to prove the company's case. It's not the company's job to prove the Office of Public Counsel's case. Everyone is on the line to prove their own case. It's easy to criticize. What's hard to do is to come up with a better method. And so, I mean, the adversarial process has literally worked for thousands of years. Nobody's come up with a better way, short of having a philosopher king, and then we all argue about who gets to be the philosopher king. I'm willing, but nobody pretty much else is willing for me to be the philosopher king. So that's how it works. It typically doesn't get nasty. It can get kind of ugly at times. I've seen witnesses crying when an attorney got to be a bully, in my opinion, but it can go that way. Typically, it's just pretty straightforward. What do you know? What do you not know? Why do you think this? All right, so we've got the hearing. A couple quick caveats I'm going to toss out there for you. Couple's terms, used and useful and known and measurable. Used and useful means before an item can move to rate base, it must be used and useful. Remember, rate base is all that physical stuff, and we get to earn a return on it. Well, before you can put something in rate base, you actually have to show that it's being used for the customers. If you're building a substation, that can be a fairly expensive piece of property to put together. Certainly if you're putting in a power plant, rate cases get timed around when that's all finished, and that means the testing has to be done, and it actually has to be in service and running and actually serving customers by a certain date within that rate case. Typically there's a true up point somewhere in there, and that says anything up to here we will true up, and anything after that, bring it to your next rate case. So timing becomes fairly critical for some of these issues, because you want to start recovering that money in rate base as soon as you can, but you don't want to miss your deadline and have your rate case timed and then have your piece of property, whatever it is, not be ready in time and make it past that due date. So this makes it very difficult to pay for very expensive long-term projects. Where this came into play for the most part was building the nuclear plants that became very expensive, and they didn't realize how expensive they were going to be when they first started, and by the time they get done with the project, it cost billions of dollars, and the utility is saying, we can't get money to pay for this because we can't put this into rate base, so we can't get the money back from customers to pay the interest costs on this. And so some allowances were made and some special laws were passed specifically to deal with very large expenditures going into rate base. It didn't make anybody happy, but pretty much they had to figure out some way to do this because the companies were going broke and that couldn't be allowed to happen. So used and useful, and then known and measurable. That's before an item can be included in revenue requirements, its cost must be known and measurable. The item that jumps up to me is, if you know you're going to have your annual pay increase occurs every January, for instance, and you've got a union contract that says for the next 3 years, these increases are going to happen. It's going to be this percent, and it's going to happen on this date, and here's the employees to which it applies, and they make this much money, and you can do the math and actually figure out this is how much it's going to cost. That's known, that's measurable, and you can build that into, if that's happening within the time frame of your rate case, you can true up for that even if you haven't gotten to that date quite yet. For salaried employees, for non-union employees, let me put it that way, where you may budget, we know we're going to pay them X percent more come January 1st, but you don't have a contract in place that says you're going to pay them X percent more, and some employees may make more, some may make less, and it varies, and you can't actually calculate, here's exactly how much it's going to be. That's not known and measurable. Now, there are arguments as to whether that is known and measurable. I mean, obviously, for planning purposes, companies know that's going to happen. They know about what it's going to get. But that's an argument, all right? Known and measurable, used and useful. Both of these influence the timing of revenue cases, all right? All right. Regulatory lag. This is where I've talked to you about how these cases typically run from 8 to 11 months. Before that, you've got a test year, which is a 12-month period. This can be a historic test year. It can be a forecast test year. It can be a combination of the two. It can be normalized or actual, which means the weather may have been hot, and so you have to reduce revenues and sales. For an electric utility, the weather may have been cooler through the summer, and so for an electric utility that's counting on air conditioning load, the sales may have been low, and so to normalize it, you'd actually raise that and you'd increase the revenue. Some places normalize, some don't. But you've got this 12-month period that you look at in depth to use for all of those exhibits that you created at the beginning of this case. You've got case preparation, which can take 6 months, 4 months, I think was what we were running. We were trying to run towards 3 months. Remember what we're talking, if it's a $24 million case, that's $2 million a month. And so if you can shorten up your preparation time by a month, that's worth some real dollars. The case litigation, that runs whatever the statutory level is in your jurisdiction. Settlements can shorten it, and the interval in practice varies by state. With a historic test year, it can be over 2 years from the time a utility identifies it will be under earning until it starts collecting the new rates. So it's critical for a company to keep track of how all of this is playing out. All right, the conclusion here, the commissioners will then review all of this estimate, the commissioners will review all of the evidence. That includes the testimony, the exhibits, the transcripts from the hearings, the briefs. Briefs are basically where the attorneys go through and summarize the whole case and give legal reasons why this should or should not happen. They will then issue an order saying, all right, here's our decision, here's the dollar level, we're done. There can then be a rehearing. You can say, hey, you guys got it wrong. You can imagine how well that goes over. You guys got it wrong. We want you to try it again. If there was a typo, if there was a math error, if something like that, if something was clearly misapprehended, that typically is okay. They'll go with that. But if you're just saying, hey, I didn't like the result you reached, they pretty much say, yeah, we decided what we decided, we're done. You then go to an appeals process if you feel that's appropriate. That's where you actually go to the courts. The courts don't want anything to do with rate cases, utility stuff. There's a whole commission designed with expertise in that. They will look at, were the rules followed? Did everybody get a fair shake? And if they find something didn't work out just right, the rules weren't followed or whatever, they will remand it back to the commission and say, we need you to rehear this item. The court's I'm not familiar with the court jumping in and saying, okay, we'll decide this and tell the commission what to do. They'll just say, no, this was done wrong, commission, redo this. Once that's over, then there's actually an implementation tariff where whatever the commission may have said, we like this and this and this and that from over there, and nobody may have actually done that calculation of all these different pieces, and so you actually have to calculate all of that, come up with a final number, create tariffs, and then those implementation tariffs are filed, they get approved, and that is when the actual rates go up or down depending on how it turned out. That's how a revenue case works. I hope you learned something. Thanks for sticking with me. And I think I'm done.